Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I want to talk to you about when it makes sense to abandon something that you consider to be a duty. So the basic idea is that sometimes dereliction of duty is the right choice, and so I'm trying to unpack when that might be, because it's not always obvious. There are some obvious times when this would be true, like, for example, if by sticking to something that you previously or currently think of as a duty, you are going to cause greater harm to yourself or others than you would by abandoning it. That's a perfect example. That's pretty non-controversial. Similarly, you could have a situation where you had another conflicting duty that took priority over the other duty, and so you basically just did a cost benefit type analysis and said, I have to stick to duty B because duty A is less important. Pretty non-controversial there too, although I'm sure we could come up with some controversial scenarios in which that's the case. Another place that this might come up is if by continuing to follow a duty or to stick by what you've set out to do, you cause yourself a significant loss of integrity or some other violation of your strongly held beliefs or moral code. Also not that controversial there. The edit this out. Edit this part out. Or just leave it in. Who cares? Um, it's fun. Okay, that was really just a brain fart when I was trying to come up with the last sort of non-controversial reason to abandon a duty, which is you fulfilled the purpose of the duty and it's no longer actually really relevant. Like, you kind of completed it more or less, and so it may be time to move on. However, there are a lot of times when you need to, or you have a conflict in your life where there is something that is a duty that meets none of those criteria for being an easy one to say, yes, this is the thing that I need to abandon because there's this, more important reason to do it. Oftentimes we might find ourselves in a situation where intellectually or culturally, we find ourselves in a position where we're fulfilling a duty that nonetheless feels wrong to us. It strikes us on some deep level as being out of alignment with our true selves, or out of alignment with, I was just realizing how dark it's getting out there, and how weird the lighting is starting to look on my video. I'm new at this. And I'm sitting on the floor. In such cases, we might think to ourselves that there are a lot of aspects of our lives where we feel an obligation towards things that were essentially acculturated into us, in a sense, brainwashed into us over the course of our education, the course of our upbringing, or even through media that we consume. So there's a lot of potentially conflicting signals, especially coming at us in the form of rational arguments about how we should behave and why we should behave a certain way. And these can come in the form of moral arguments. They can come in the form of logical arguments. They can come in the form of peer pressure, or pressure from authority figures in our lives, family, or even legal authorities. So there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of end up feeling this type of brainwashing. or this type of like more kind of super ego pressure to conform to notions of what a good life looks like or what a dutiful person does in a given situation. So what about when these things that we might even be aligned with intellectually, and in terms of our deeply held belief systems that we think of as being our own beliefs, what happens when those things end up being at odds with a deeper felt or experienced sense of what we should either be doing or what we feel is right or wrong? Now, this is a situation that is a lot more tricky to navigate in some ways, because what it ends up often looking like is that we feel one thing, like we have an intuitive or instinctive sense of what we should be doing, and we have a million different reasons, rational and otherwise, that sit in a kind of higher point in our consciousness, a more top of mind kind of part of our consciousness. And these reasons end up oftentimes overriding the more deeply felt sense of what is the right thing for us to be doing in that situation. So, and I'm sure we've all been there. Like, even like it's hard to even, like, the fact of having a job, we've all had that experience in the workplace, I'm sure, at some point, where our instincts are telling us one thing and our duties as an employee or our duties as in whatever role we're in are telling us another thing. And of course, I'm not trying to make some blanket statement about how you should always follow instinct or you should always follow duty. What I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to get us to like get to a deeper way of looking at when it makes sense, to giving us some tools and some insights in terms of when it makes sense to potentially abandon what you've previously held as a duty. So, one second. So while we might say that our intuition and our instinctive responses to things are certainly potentially fallible, especially if we have bad information that we've stored in our brains. Like incorrect ideas about the nature of things can result in deeply felt feelings that are actually fundamentally incorrect, out of like disjointed from the nature of objective reality. So what that means is that sometimes intuition and instinct is a powerful tool that is giving us really helpful and incredibly fast information. But other times it can lead us down the wrong path if it's being informed by beliefs or understandings about the world that are themselves incomplete. So like you might think somebody committed a crime, and you might truly believe that this, thing is true, but then later you might find out that they didn't. And up until the time that you found out that they were actually innocent, your instincts about that might lead you down a totally incorrect path in terms of what you think a moral judgment would be in that situation. So that's just one example. On the other hand, the same is also true for our intellectual abilities as well. So we can reason ourselves into all kinds of things, right? And sometimes they are sometimes useful and sometimes less useful, and sometimes or my point here is that rationality doesn't give us a pass. Like, we can make poor choices being rational, and we can make poor choices being intuitive. So neither one is sufficient. You can't just make any blanket statements about either. But then really, as I'm speaking, what I'm realizing is incorrect about even the way I'm framing this is that it isn't a dichotomy between intuition and rationality. These two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, intuition itself can be rational and it can also be irrational. And rationality can be built on irrational presumptions. So, anyway, what I'm saying is that's a false dichotomy. I promise I'm going to get better at this. Someday I'm going to get better at this. I will get better at this. I will get better at this. I will get better at this. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that intuition is not necessarily irrational, and that we're never doing all one or all the other. Basically, these processes are intertwined. However, when it comes to duties that are ascribed to us from the external world, so like the things that we are acculturated into, these tend to come at us from a rational perspective, primarily. There's a sense of, the way that the laws of the land are written and communicated are presented to us with this presumption of this makes the most sense. And they don't necessarily make the most sense, as we've all, I'm sure, had those trains of thought where we're like, why do we have this law? It doesn't make any sense. Nonetheless, having the force of law behind it gives it a kind of presumptive truthiness, and having the force of the state, the implied violence of the state behind something kind of dismisses a lot of argument in a way that is quite unhelpful. In some cases, of course, it can be helpful, I guess, I'm sure we can come up with plenty of arguments for that as well. But in your own life, when you're trying to assess something, like, I guess what I really want to have be a takeaway from this video, as disjointed and ridiculous as it is that I would like you to notice that feeling, to try to like bring more to the surface when you have that like feeling of disquiet or discomfort, or even just a subtle sense of like, maybe I should zag when I'm being told to zig, that bring that to the foreground, notice that, and then sit quietly with it. Just be quiet, internally, allow yourself to feel what that is in a non-judgmental way. And you might be surprised, if you really allow that space to breathe, what kinds of new things might come into your life. Because sometimes the things that we are convinced of as our prime duties take certain choices off the table for us. They're so fundamental to the way that we view ourselves, or the way that we view the way we need to act for various reasons, whether they're pragmatic reasons, or whether they're moral reasons, or whether they're reasons of pride, that when we take these items off the table, so to speak, we say, we don't even allow ourselves to think of these possibilities as being possibilities. This is often the doorway to dysfunction, and it is often the doorway to years of suffering and years of going against your instincts and going against your intuition. So I sort of muddied the waters of intuition and instinct with a bunch of chatter a few minutes ago, but I want to clarify it a little bit by saying some things to consider about why those things are valuable, and perhaps even more valuable than the wisdom from our society that we receive in terms of language and training and upbringing. Intuition and instinct are things that have been built into us over, you know, millions of years as humans and even billions of years as life forms. And, really probably in some way an infinite amount of time. So the things that come to us in the form of the abstractions of symbolic reasoning and language and mass culture are much, 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 much newer things. So if I had to pick only one to value, which I would never do, but if I had to pick only one, luckily I'm not presented with that, but I would fall on the side of listening to my intuition and my instinct, because that I think is going to be less fallible than what you have internalized in terms of language and symbolic reasoning. Now, this is not always going to be the case, but I think there is a very strong intuitive argument there. So if you sit with that, I think you can feel it in your bones in some way. You can really tap into why that rings true. Now, it only works though if you have developed your intuition and you have learned to start to listen to it and prioritize it. And what that takes is actually getting out of your head. A lot of people live almost entirely in a web of symbols. They live in words primarily. They're not embodied, and they're not as in tune with silence. One of the primary reasons that people are interested in things like mindfulness and meditation is to touch into this deeper sense of what is real and this deeper sense of what is true that can only come from silence. In my experience, silence is the biggest teacher. And I don't mean literal silence, like no sounds. What I mean is letting go of the meaning-making linguistic structures and symbolic structures that we orient ourselves with in the human world. And one of the ways, or there's two ways that I first really started to do this. One was taking hot baths, and the other was spending time in nature. Taking hot baths did it for me because it sort of tricked me into meditating. This was supposed to be another video, but I'm just going to do it right now. But yeah, that's when I actually started realizing that I understood what meditation was meant to be. I'd always tried to meditate, and it was impossible. I was just like, this sucks. I hate it. I don't want to sit still. Why am I doing this? All right, like this is supposed to be doing something, but I'm just sitting here. This is dumb. And eventually, but then I started to enjoy taking hot baths and just kind of zoning out. And then one day I realized, I was like, holy shit, I'm meditating. And I didn't even mean to. It was just like, I was just sitting there and like, my mind kind of was like in this meditative state. And then it all just clicked. I was like, oh shit, I'm seeing it. I finally was feeling it and understanding it on a level, and it didn't take anything. I just like kind of let go. It was almost like accidental. And the other thing that does it for me is being in nature. And one of the reasons why that is true is because being out in nature, especially solo, spending a lot of solo time in nature, being solo, of course, there's not a lot of human chatter to distract me. There's not like somebody rattling on and on about something. And so my brain is allowed to kind of, again, relax, open up, let go. And this is like infinitely easier the longer you spend out in nature by yourself. So like by day 4 alone in the mountains, your entire sensory system opens up and relaxes in a different way. You're letting in all the sounds, you're letting in every rustle of the leaves. And you're not having to filter out all the information that we have to filter out when we're in cities and in urban environments, or even in small towns where we have to, look out for cars and all these things that we're basically trying to keep out of our conscious mind or just in our minds enough to keep us safe, but no more. I think being out in the natural world without human interaction also keys you into this geologic time scale. So it's like the world of humanity becomes extremely almost irrelevant. It becomes, you see it for what it is, which is like almost nothing in the grand scheme of the expanse of the universe and time. So I want to talk more about what this means for our understanding of the idea of morality in future videos. But for now, I just want to wrap it up because this is already really long by saying that I would encourage you to start to see morality as something that is an emergent property of situations that are incredibly complex and have so many different variables that it cannot possibly be a fixed and static thing, that it relies on this extremely fast and deep process of intuitive information processing that we have evolved for just that reason, because the addition of language, which is what allowed our species to propagate like ants, as opposed to living the way that we kind of historically lived in small groups like all other primates. I'm tired. The intuitive reason, the intuitive reasoning that I'm talking about evolved over a much longer period of time, and this really fell apart at the end. So thank you. This is great. Great. Good job. Goodbye.